The case begins with a series of mysterious murders. The story begins on the quiet, moonlit streets of Portland, Oregon, a city where the hum of life echoes through its charming coffee shops, serene parks, and towering evergreen trees. By day it's a picture of peace, but by night, especially as the fall fog rolls in, it feels like the setting of a sinister thriller. Over the span of 6 months, the city, known for its progressive demeanor and vibrant scenery, was thrown into panic due to a chain of unsolved murders. The victims? 5 women, all in their late 20s to early 30s, living in various neighborhoods of Portland. They weren't connected by their backgrounds or professions. One was an art teacher at a local elementary school. Another worked the night shift as a waitress in a downtown diner. Another, a history major just weeks away from her master's degree. On the surface, there didn't appear to be any discernible pattern. But when the case details landed on the desk of Portland's Major Crimes Division, one detail sent a wave of unease through the investigators. All the women had one thing in common. They were killed late at night in isolated locations. Each body was discovered in seemingly random alleyways, wooded trails at the edge of the suburbs, or desolate parking lots. They bore signs of a peculiar, calculated ruthlessness. The killer had left no calling card, at least not an obvious one. However, it was clear from the knife wounds that the culprit was methodical, experienced, and utterly depraved. The city was on edge. Local newspapers coined chilling headlines: Portland's Shadow Stalker and Who's Behind the Fog of Fear. Live updates flooded nightly television newscasts. Community members began pulling together, creating carpool systems for women working late shifts, investing in self-defense tools, and flooding hardware stores to purchase every lock and bar they could get their hands on. But the unnerving reality was this: the killer's motives were as mysterious as their identity. The city's residents seemed to be living alongside a ghost. In the thick of public outcry, lead detective Emma Wallace took the case. Wallace, a seasoned investigator of 15 years, wasn't a stranger to horrifying crimes, but something about this spree struck worrisome chords. "This isn't your typical opportunist," she told her team one late night back at headquarters. "This guy plans, he watches, he waits." For Wallace, this wasn't just a test of her professional dedication. It became personal. The kind of personal that keeps you up at 3 a.m. replaying autopsy reports word for word in your head. What made these murders especially bizarre wasn't just the stark randomness of the locations, but, disturbingly, the lack of forensic evidence. The killer seemed to anticipate every modern investigative device the police might employ. There were no fingerprints, no hair or skin samples, no DNA traces under fingernails. Even surveillance footage from nearby businesses came up blank, either because the crime scenes were too obscure, or someone had made sure they weren't caught on tape. An unofficial task force of Wallace's most trusted investigators was formed within weeks. "Split every piece of evidence like it's glass," she'd bark, pacing in front of a board filled with victim profiles and Portland city maps. From tire tracks found near one of the bodies to the unusual use of leaves from red alder trees, forensic specialists noted these peculiarities but couldn't yet connect them. The case was a maddening puzzle missing half the pieces. For citizens of Portland, everyday life now came with a shadow of suspicion. Who was the killer? A neighbor? A stranger that walked among them at local farmers markets? Or waved from the corner window of a coffee shop? Many looked twice at passers-by on evening walks, attempting to catch something, anything out of the ordinary. But the killer? The killer was still out there, likely savoring the escalating tension, studying every move as the investigation unfurled. Portland wasn't ready for what was coming next. The killer's cold calculations and selection of victims. The killer wasn't just another violent criminal acting on impulse. No, this person wasn't a reckless assailant targeting the first unfortunate soul who crossed their path. Instead, it became ruthlessly clear that this was someone calculating, someone who viewed murder as an art form, executed with surgical precision and detached sophistication. Through weeks of investigation, lead detective Emma Wallace and her team pieced together a chilling profile. The killer deliberately targeted women leading lives that appeared, at least on the surface, to be ordinary, but carried subtle vulnerabilities that made them perfect prey. Late-night employees, college students pulling long study hours, single women in modest apartments, all seemingly plucked from their routines and thrust into a nightmare. "The guy's a hunter," Wallace said in one late-night brainstorming session, standing before the cluttered corkboard displaying maps, mugshots, and timelines. "He doesn't stumble upon victims by accident, he stalks them. He isolates them mentally before he physically strikes. This wasn't just theory, it was backed by disturbing evidence. Surveillance from one victim's neighborhood revealed a dark figure blending into the shadows. The figure lingered outside her duplex for days, perhaps weeks, learning her habits, noting when she walked her dog or when her kitchen light flicked off for bed. The precision timing was no accident. He made sure there would be no witnesses, no intervention, and most horrifyingly, no escape. The victims shared overlapping traits in their routines, even if they didn't know one another personally. Working late in isolated locations, walking through dim-lit streets, or frequenting areas devoid of foot traffic after hours. That was the killer's playground. Places where Portland's iconic soft glow of amber streetlights cast long, eerie shadows, perfect for ambush. While the city's sense of safety eroded, the killer's astonishing ability to stay undetected created a gripping psychological terror among Portland's residents. This wasn't someone who thrived on chaos or sloppy crime scenes. Instead, they carefully orchestrated each murder, systematically eliminating risks and ensuring the body was discovered only long after their departure. Victim profiles also painted an unsettling picture of the killer's psychology. Victimology studies pointed to someone who harbored a deep, festering resentment, possibly toward women in general. Detectives theorized the murderer didn't choose women who reminded him of past grievances randomly. They theorized his past was riddled with rejection or humiliation, which he now sought to erase through his acts of dominance. Every strike began with observation. As the fog rolled in late at night, covering empty suburban streets, the killer waited, cloaked in darkness. Witness testimonies from neighbors added bleak details. "I thought I saw him a few times," one neighbor said nervously after the latest murder. "Dark clothing, hoodie up, just standing there. But before I could get a good look, he was gone, like a shadow." Psychological experts assisting the case hypothesized that the killer viewed his victims as symbols rather than people, each attack premeditated, each moment choreographed to perfection. Even the choice of weapon, a simple but brutal knife, spoke volumes of his confidence and desire for control. A gun would have been quicker, but where's the fear, the confusion, the power play in that? A knife requires proximity, intimacy, and paradoxically, precision. The killer's chosen blade left ragged, shallow wounds on some victims and surgical-like precision strikes on others, showing he could switch between chaos and control depending on the situation. "He doesn't just attack," said forensic psychologist Dr. Janice Rivers, reviewing the case's behavioral patterns. "He dominates. He doesn't simply take their lives, he takes their final moments, transforms them into something he controls entirely. The brutality isn't incidental, it's integral." And then came the coldest realization. This wasn't terror for terror's sake. Each step of his plan, every moment leading to the final act, revolved around something bigger than just inflicting pain. It was about mastery, about perfection. From stalking and pinpointing vulnerabilities to carefully calculated escapes, the killer rarely, if ever, left physical clues. There were no hairs, no fingerprints, no smudged trails of sweat or stray fibers. Law enforcement was chasing a ghost who reveled in creating paranoia. One of the hardest pills to swallow for Wallace and her team was the systematic nature of it all. The killer knew what he was doing. He'd been practicing. This was not someone who had recently snapped. This was controlled carnage, honed over time. The aftermath of each murder painted Portland red, not just with the literal blood left behind, but in the panic that gripped the streets. Self-defense classes were booked solid. Gun shops reported spikes in handgun purchases. Women began walking in groups or avoiding errands after sunset altogether. The landscape of the city changed. Its once welcoming neighborhoods became ominous with whispers of, "What if he's out there tonight?" fluttering across back fences and office break rooms. The one question that remained unanswered for Wallace was this: did he enjoy it? Murder, for all its calculated coldness in this case, often carries an emotional flame. Some do it for revenge, others out of anger or desperation. But this killer? He showed no desperation, no urgency. If anything, the clinical nature of his actions made detectives wonder, was this a game to him? Portland lived in dread, but the killer worked without fear, and worse still, he was getting better. Clues at the crime scene and the first hints. The murder scenes weren't just crime scenes, they were messages. That's what Detective Emma Wallace began to realize as the evidence, scant as it was, trickled into her team's headquarters at Portland's Major Crimes Division. The killer wasn't sloppy, didn't rush, and didn't leave behind obvious evidence. But no matter how careful the perpetrator thought they were, Every crime told a story. And sometimes, the smallest detail could unravel entire chapters. The first body was found on the desolate edge of Forest Park, a sprawling urban wilderness often hailed as the lungs of Portland. An avid jogger stumbled upon the gruesome scene in the early hours of a foggy Saturday morning. A woman sprawled beneath a tangle of moss-covered branches, her lifeless body covered in shallow knife wounds, blood pooling into the forest floor like nature itself was mourning her. She was dressed in her work uniform, a navy blue polo shirt bearing the logo of a 24-hour diner downtown, and her ID badge reading Sarah Lopez, dangled loosely from her neck. What struck investigators the most was the quiet of it all. The crime scene wasn't loud, there were no signs of a struggle, no screams heard by nearby homes or hikers. It was like she had been silently plucked from existence. The only clue? Drag marks in the soil leading from the victim's body toward the trail, as though she'd been carefully placed for someone to find. It wasn't meant to be subtle, it was meant to be haunting. By the time the second body was discovered, barely 3 weeks later, the Portland Police Department recognized they weren't dealing with two random acts of violence. They were dealing with a serial killer. The victim, 29-year-old Grace Calhoun, was found in a dimly lit parking lot behind a local laundromat. Her folded laundry, still warm from the dryers, was stacked neatly inside her car. Her body, however, lay just feet away, slumped between two cars, her throat slit with clinical precision. The killer hadn't rummaged through her purse or stolen her valuables. It was staged to communicate something beyond theft or desperation. "Look how neatly it's arranged," Detective Wallace murmured to herself at the scene. "This isn't chaos. This is control." Forensics combed the parking lot for hours, collecting fibers, dusting for fingerprints, snapping hundreds of photographs. And yet, just like with Lopez, there was virtually nothing. No DNA traces, no discernible boot tracks, not even a stray hair. Whoever this killer was, they weren't new to this. This was someone who understood the technology of modern policing, likely as well as any investigator. Wallace, running on caffeine and sleepless nights, began compiling every scrap of evidence in her war room. But to call it evidence felt generous. It was more like whispers of a ghost, subtle hints that something, or someone, had been there. At both scenes, investigators found faint traces of a highly specific type of soil containing volcanic ash, found only in areas near Portland's dormant volcanoes. "So he's traveling," Wallace remarked, staring at the analysis report. "He's moving through areas he knows will make our job harder." The third victim, Jenna McBride, broke the pattern slightly. And it was in this break that Wallace and her team found one of their first truly valuable clues. Jenna was last seen leaving the campus library after a late-night study session. Her body was discovered 2 days later in a creek bed just off a hiking trail. This time, though, the killer had slipped. Just barely. Caught near her body was a single strand of fishing line, tangled among rocks close to the creek bed. It was an odd detail, one that barely registered among the chaos of the crime scene, but for Wallace, it was enough. "What's someone doing with fishing line all the way out here?" she asked the forensic team. "This isn't a fishing spot." The real revelation came when Wallace compared the fishing line to the faint scratches found on the victim's wrists. The killer had used it to bind her, albeit temporarily. The scratch marks weren't full cuts, likely because the victim had loosened the bindings during an attempted escape, but this moment of panic, the killer losing control, however brief, marked the first tangible misstep. Wallace hoped it wouldn't be the last. By this point, a clear pattern was emerging. Each attack occurred in isolated areas where the killer could work unnoticed, but there was always an underlying current of ritual. The victims weren't killed where they were targeted. They'd been transported carefully, their final resting places seemingly chosen for dramatic effect. Wallace called it performance murder, a term that made her colleagues uneasy. But in her mind, that's exactly what it was. A macabre show by someone who wanted the attention his crimes would inevitably bring. Forensic specialists continued scouring the locations of the attacks for anomalies, and soon enough, a chilling connective thread emerged: alder leaves. While inconspicuous on their own, a significant number of alder leaves were found scattered near all 3 crime scenes. The leaves were damp and freshly fallen, yet didn't match the immediate environment around the victims. It was as though the killer had brought them in intentionally, sprinkling them like final touches on a piece of dark art. To Wallace it was clear, the killer was taunting them. Each meticulously left detail wasn't an accident, it was a signature. In her experience, killers fell into 2 camps, those who wanted to stay completely invisible, and those who wanted to be unforgettably remembered. This one clearly fell into the latter. But it wasn't just the alder leaves, the fishing line, or the volcanic soil that ignited Wallace's frustration. It was the calculated lack of anything else. No bloody footprints leading to or from the crime scenes. No tool marks from forced entry. No stray cigarette butts, fast food wrappers, or handkerchiefs. After 3 crime scenes, the killer's carefulness was as much of a clue as what he'd left behind. He was perfecting his craft, and that perfection was delaying justice. For the first time in her career, Wallace felt like she was working against someone who understood her better than she understood him. "He's not leaving evidence because he doesn't have to," she muttered one afternoon after poring through a stack of disappointing lab reports. "Every move he makes is deliberate." In their increasingly sleepless nights, Wallace's team began debating whether this was standard behavior for a serial killer, or something more insidious. "This could be a dry run," one detective suggested grimly during a midnight meeting. "What if all this practice is leading up to something worse?" It was a thought that kept Wallace awake long after the city lights dimmed. For every alder leaf, fishing line, and volcanic ash sample they collected, she knew the killer had deliberately left 10 other pieces of evidence carefully erased. But there was always a misstep, she told herself. Always a slip. Her team just had to find it. Connecting the cases. A journey through the chaos. By the time the 4th victim's body was discovered, it was no longer whispers of a lone psychopath haunting Portland. It was a citywide reckoning. The name The Portland Shadow began surfacing on social media, and local news stations churned out breaking headlines faster than the police could process evidence. The atmosphere hung thick with fear, and the unspoken question loomed over every investigative meeting. How many more? Detective Emma Wallace sat at the head of a long, battle-worn conference table in the dim, fluorescent-lit incident room at Portland's Major Crimes Division. The walls were a chaos of maps, photographs, time-stamped printouts, and case files, each detail tacked on with thumbtacks and connected by taut strings of red yarn. It was a mosaic of carnage that only someone like Wallace could sift through without drowning in despair. The city was counting on her to make sense of it all. "All right, let's run through this again," Wallace began, pinching the bridge of her nose in exhaustion. "Sarah Lopez, Grace Calhoun, Jenna McBride, and now, Melissa Hart. What's the link? What ties these lives together besides a maniac with a knife?" Her team exchanged uneasy glances. Detective Mike Sutter spoke first, flipping through a dog-eared notebook. "They lived in different areas. They had different routines, different jobs, different lifestyles. It's like he's picking them at random." Wallace shook her head. "Not random. There's a method here. We just haven't cracked it yet." It was true that the victims appeared unrelated on the surface. Sarah was a waitress working graveyard shifts downtown. Grace was an accountant who often stayed late at her office to meet tax season deadlines. Jenna was a grad student burning the midnight oil in a university library. Melissa, most recently, was a bartender closing up after hours at a dive bar on the outskirts of town. Their lives didn't intersect, yet each was targeted in eerie isolation, yanked from environments where they should have felt safe. But Wallace, seasoned in studying the psychology of killers, knew that serial murderers like this didn't pick true strangers. There was always a psychological algorithm, an invisible thread the killer followed, binding the victims to his twisted sense of logic. "We have behavior clusters," Wallace said, tapping her pen against Melissa Hart's crime scene photo. "Look at the locations. He's not attacking where he finds them. Sarah was found miles away from her job. Same for Grace. The victims vanish first, and then he chooses their final scene. Why go to the trouble of moving their bodies?" "For control?" Sutter ventured, though there was no conviction in his tone. "Control and something else," Wallace answered firmly. "He's sending a message. We just don't know what it is yet." Over the next sleepless week, the team dug deeper, pouring hours into crime scene reports, witness interviews, and forensic analysis. Patterns emerged slowly, small, almost imperceptible consistencies that, when compiled, began to sketch an outline of their phantom. The victims weren't killed immediately. At least 2 of them showed signs of prolonged violence, as if the killer had taken his time before finishing them off. And the weapons? Bladed, always. The wounds varied from shallow pricks to deep, decisive thrusts, suggesting the killer lingered in the moment of attack. An overlay of Portland city maps revealed another chilling connection. The geographic locations, while seemingly random, formed a loose crescent spanning the city's southwest. It wasn't careful, but it wasn't careless either. The biggest breakthrough came while reinvestigating Sarah Lopez's case. A patrol officer, reviewing surveillance footage from one of Portland's ubiquitous boutique coffee shops, caught a fleeting frame that had been overlooked, a hooded figure loitering near Sarah's car hours before her shift began. The angle was poor, the lighting dim, but it was something. "He's staking them out," Wallace deduced, scanning the footage repeatedly. "He's watching and learning before he makes a move." Her comment sparked a new focus for the team. Surveillance reviews were expanded to areas around all the victims' known haunts. They scoured hours of mundane footage, gas station parking lots, apartments, bus depots, anything that might put a face to the phantom killer. More patterns fell into place. Every victim had at least one unsolved public sighting of an unfamiliar man tailing them in the hours or days leading to their disappearance. But the descriptions varied wildly. A hoodie here, a baseball cap there. If it was the same man, and Wallace was certain it was, he had a talent for slipping into crowds and fading out of existence the moment eyes turned toward him. While the detectives drowned in data, Wallace called in expert consultants, a forensic psychologist from the University of Oregon and a criminal profiler from the FBI. Both confirmed the killer's rapidly evolving modus operandi. He was refining his craft with each attack. By the fourth murder, it was clear the killer was escalating. He'd gone from short encounters to longer, more drawn-out attacks. He wasn't just killing, he was savoring the process. The profiler proposed a grim theory. "This isn't a single narrative," he explained. "What you're dealing with is a cycle of dominance, control, and release. The killer doesn't see these women as people, he sees them as targets, pieces in a game he controls entirely. He likely begins by observing them from afar, identifying their routines, vulnerabilities. Once he acts, his choices of leaving the bodies in specific locations, those are deliberate. He's taunting you by leaving his mark." Wallace's lips tightened. "Mark? He hasn't left a signature." "Not in the classic sense," the profiler admitted, "but he's still leaving one, detective. Look harder." Between bouts of frustration and veiled dread, Wallace and her team worked tirelessly, eventually finding other consistencies in the killer's behavior. The alder leaves, initially dismissed as natural debris, became peculiar upon closer examination. Why were they found on the bodies but not in the immediate areas around the crime scenes? A botanical specialist confirmed they had been transported subtly from a separate location. Then there was the volcanic soil from Mount Hood, which appeared faintly at two separate scenes. It wasn't much, but it confirmed what Wallace suspected. He was moving across predictable but meticulous routes, and Portland's dense forests provided the perfect cover. Piece by piece, the case began to take shape. The randomness that had plagued the investigation wasn't random at all. It was the carefully orchestrated chaos of a predator who knew the balance between exposure and anonymity. The killer was cloaked in familiarity, blending in just enough so that no one could pinpoint his presence. The deeper Wallace got, the more she realized she wasn't just chasing a killer, she was engaging in a battle of wits, a game he was winning for now. The investigation team tracks the killer. The hunt for the killer intensified. By this point, the quiet streets of Portland were no longer just eerily empty. There was an air of suffocating fear that blanketed the city. Women wouldn't walk alone at night anymore, local businesses adjusted their hours, and even the most innocent late-night joggers avoided the dimly lit pathways. But as the city's unease grew deeper, Detective Emma Wallace and her hand-picked squad pushed harder to track the shadow that had haunted their streets for months. It wasn't just the Portland Police Department involved anymore. With a confirmed pattern of linked murders, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, joined the case, granting the task force access to resources, profiling expertise, and technology unheard of in local law enforcement. It was now a full-scale operation. Wallace, now the lead investigator overseeing a joint task force, transformed an old abandoned warehouse into what locals called HQ. Inside, the atmosphere pulsated with energy and purpose. Desks held stacks of case files, while whiteboards and projection screens were filled with timelines, location maps, and scribbled notes. A wall-sized map of Portland served as the epicenter of the room, highlighted by clusters of red pushpins marking the known crime scenes with yellow ones tracing significant sightings or discoveries. Strings of multicolored yarn stretched between points, a chaotic representation of the killer's scope. Each morning began with a briefing in the heart of this modern war room. Wallace, coffee in hand and circles under her sharp eyes, paced back and forth as she updated the team. "We're dealing with someone who knows how to disappear," she reminded them. "But we're not walking blind. We've got patterns now, Vulnerable targets, quiet times, specific zones, and we know this, he's not going to stop unless we stop him. The FBI brought in advanced methods to enhance the investigation, including geographic profiling software which analyzed the locations of the crime scenes to triangulate possible areas where the killer could be residing. Whoever this guy is, he's traveling light, noted Agent David Marks, the BAU's field profiler. Marks was a 20-year veteran of the FBI, no stranger to the darkness of humanity. He's either blending in somewhere urban, like downtown, or he's tucked away deep in the outskirts where he's confident no one's eyes are on him. As the investigation pressed forward, the task force shifted their strategy. Surveillance became the focus. Dozens of newly installed city cameras were manned by analysts around the clock in neighborhoods tied to the victims. Patrol officers were given explicit instructions to check abandoned buildings, dark alleyways, and desolate parking lots. Dead-end tips poured in by the hundreds, each one clogging the ears and time of the already overworked team, yet Wallace never shut them out. That one tip, she'd remind them, could be the crack in his mask. One of their breakthrough strategies was centered around bait deployment. Female undercover officers were positioned in high-risk locations at night, disguised as workers, students, or joggers. Wallace, reviewing their positioning on a screen, gave the go-ahead with a warning tone. Keep your distance, and don't let him see you coming. We're not giving him any excuses to add to our body count. The risk was nerve-shattering, but Wallace knew no measure was too extreme to lure their phantom out of hiding. Leads trickled in faster than ever before. Reports from eyewitnesses painted the picture of a man who wore anonymity like armor. Average height, average build, hooded or hat-covered, kept his head low, recounted one witness. Another claimed to have seen him lingering, standing still like he was waiting for someone. But even the eyewitness accounts felt unreliably vague, fitting the profile of too many men in a city as diverse as Portland. Every grain of useful information, however small, was scrutinized to exhaustion. The task force strategized on hypothetical routes the killer might have used. He doesn't just vanish into thin air, Wallace argued during a late-night meeting. This man walks our streets, drives, or hell, maybe he bikes through our neighborhoods. He's out there. Someone will see him if we push hard enough. Their focus then turned to logistics. Previous crime scenes were revisited meticulously. The killer's access to obscure areas, a stretch of forest trail, a backlot off a forgotten highway, a creek bed deep in the outskirts, hinted at familiarity with Portland's geography. Agents began interviewing construction workers, landscapers, delivery drivers, and others who might work near industrial zones or forgotten pathways. Meanwhile, forensic evidence, while scarce to the point of maddening frustration, was wrung dry for every potential lead. Additional searches of the crime scenes uncovered peculiarities missed in the initial sweeps. At Grace Calhoun's murder site, traces of an obscure type of polymer resin hinted at industrial material transfers. "We're looking for someone whose work involves transportation," suggested Marks. "Likely isolated, deliberate movement. This guy's intimate with Portland's corners and edges." More chillingly, geographical mapping narrowed down patterns and timing. Each murder happened within 2 to 3 week windows, and always on the outskirts during phases of low foot traffic. Speculations brewed intense conversations. Was there personal meaning behind these dates, or was it practical? Theories were thrown against the wall, sometimes dismissed in frustration, and sometimes sticking like adhesive to form a broader picture. "Don't let the pattern fool you," warned Marks during one briefing. "This guy isn't predictable, he's adaptable. As soon as he knows we're even a sliver close, he'll change up his routine. That's what makes predators like him dangerous." Soon, tips from residents started to come in waves. Cars seen parked too long in odd places, distant but regular figures roaming alone at strange hours. Each tip was analyzed and mapped on projections. "There's a hotspot forming," Wallace realized one fateful afternoon, circling several more clustered points between the outer city and the suburban expanse. "He's got a zone. He's hunting within this radius." This revelation prompted the task force to ramp up systematic canvasses. But the real game-changer came weeks later when an anonymous caller tipped off the police about a man behaving oddly in a wooded development near the edge of town. His van was seen parked overnight on multiple occasions, always near trails where victims were known to disappear. "He keeps coming back to the same area," the caller advised nervously. "Makes no sense unless he's up to something." Finally, after months of tireless hunting, Wallace felt the faintest sense of direction. "We've got his comfort zone," she told the room, "and that comfort zone is going to turn into his trap." The survivor reveals valuable information. No one expected a survivor. For months, the killer's methodical precision left no one alive to speak of their horrifying final moments. Each victim was silenced before justice, or even their families, could learn the truth of what they endured. But then, the unthinkable happened. A young, resilient woman named Rachel Mathis survived an encounter with a killer that the press was now dubbing the Portland Shadow. Her escape shattered the pattern, and most importantly, it brought something that had been sorely missing: answers. Rachel was rushed to Portland General Hospital in the early hours of a misty Saturday morning, her body battered but miraculously intact. A passing driver had spotted her limping out of the dense woods near Cascade Trail, wearing torn athletic leggings and a hoodie soaked in blood, not all of which was her own. The driver initially thought Rachel had been attacked by an animal, until she murmured one chilling word: him. When Detective Emma Wallace arrived at Rachel's hospital room hours later, the room was already swarming with officers, medical staff, and the protective presence of FBI agents. Wallace, weary-eyed yet laser-focused, immediately sent everyone but Rachel's doctor out of the room. She needed the details, and she needed them unfiltered. Rachel's face was bruised, her left arm in a sling, but her stare was unbroken, steely, determined, and full of fury. "You're the first person he didn't kill," Wallace started softly, sitting down beside her. She didn't want to overwhelm Rachel, but time wasn't on their side. "Rachel, I know this is going to be difficult, but anything you can tell me, anything, might be what we need to stop him." Rachel took a long, shaky breath. At first her words came fragmented, as if she were reliving the nightmare moment by moment. "I didn't see him coming," she began, her voice weak but forceful. "I was walking back from my shift at the diner, the late shift. I always took the shortcut through the trail. Less streetlights, fewer people. I guess I didn't think anyone would follow me." The killer had, unsurprisingly, been patient. Rachel said she felt someone watching her for days prior but chalked it up to paranoia. "Maybe I was just imagining it," she whispered, shaking her head. "But that night, when I saw him out of the corner of my eye just standing on the trail, he wasn't far off, maybe 10 feet. I knew I wasn't imagining anything." She described the man as middle-aged, tall, and unremarkable. He looked so normal. A hoodie. Jeans. He wasn't creepy-looking, you know. Her voice cracked slightly, forcing Wallace to hold her intense gaze steady. "But then he smiled at me. God, that smile. It wasn't big, it wasn't obvious, but it was something in his eyes, like he already knew he was going to hurt me." "The killer didn't charge at her immediately," Rachel explained. "Instead, he toyed with her. He just stood there, watching, like he was waiting for me to run, to make it more exciting for him." Rachel hadn't run at first, thinking maybe, just maybe, if she didn't react, he'd leave her alone. But when she tried to walk past him without saying a word, he lunged. "He grabbed me by the arm, shoved me to the ground. I was screaming, but we were too far from the road." Her voice faltered again as she described how he pulled a paracord from his pocket. "He tried to tie my hands. It wasn't quick, though. He wasn't in a rush. He just sat there on top of me like he had all the time in the world." Rachel's turning point had come when she noticed the pocket knife clipped to the waistband of her attacker's pants. Desperate, nails digging into dirt, she'd managed to kick him in the stomach, grab the knife, and attack wildly. "I don't even know where I stabbed him, I just kept swinging, and somehow, he let go." The killer wasn't invulnerable, it was the small, stunning revelation Wallace hadn't dared to hope for. He may have been experienced, even terrifyingly careful, but even he could be overpowered in the heat of the moment. After breaking free, Rachel had stumbled as far as she could, deeper into the woods until she found a secluded place to hide. "I thought he'd follow me," she admitted, sweat beading on her forehead as she spoke. "I waited for hours, not moving, just listening, but I think he left when I got away. That wasn't part of his plan." Wallace scribbled every detail furiously in her notebook, heart pounding as Rachel described her attacker's appearance further. "His voice was weird," Rachel added suddenly. "It wasn't completely foreign, but it had this kind of off tone, like it didn't belong here. He definitely didn't sound local." But there was one detail that made Wallace's skin crawl. Rachel described a distinct object linked to her attacker. A bike. "He had a bike," she said. "An old one, not like the road bikes you see around the city. It was black, but it looked like it had been painted over recently. It barely made any noise. He was gone before I could hear him leave." This was the moment Wallace knew they had a lead. A silent, repainted bike was enough to narrow their search dramatically. They now had a physical piece to tie to their phantom, something that could set him apart from the thousands of ordinary men walking the streets of Portland. Before Wallace left the hospital room, Rachel grabbed her wrist. "You have to stop him," she said firmly, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I got lucky, but he's not going to stop, and the next one? She might not get away." Wallace nodded, her jaw tight. "We will, Rachel," she promised, and for the first time in weeks she felt that promise wasn't empty. The bicycle, and the turning point. The bicycle was the breakthrough Detective Emma Wallace had been waiting for. For months, the elusive Portland Shadow had operated without leaving behind any significant traces. No fingerprints, no DNA, no definitive surveillance footage. His ability to vanish into the foggy streets of Portland made him feel untouchable, a phantom haunting the edges of law enforcement's grasp. That was until Rachel Mathis, the lone survivor, gave Wallace and her team an unexpected gift, a description of his bike. It wasn't just any bike, Rachel had insisted. It was an old, beaten-up model, black, but with the peculiar detail that it appeared freshly repainted. That detail struck Wallace. Why repaint the bike? Was it meant to obscure its identity? Did the killer believe anyone would notice it? Or, more sinisterly, was the bike just another tactic to blend in, an ordinary object meant to make the killer seem unremarkable and invisible in plain sight? Whatever it was, Wallace knew it mattered. The task force immediately pivoted its resources. The mention of a repainted black bike became a key focus in their briefings. Wallace didn't dismiss its significance as a minor detail. "This isn't just transportation," she told her team during a tense brainstorming session. "He uses it like a tool. It's fast, quiet, and gets him through places a car can't. Think about Portland, alleys, bike paths, trails. He's not taking obvious routes, this bike is helping him disappear." Portland, known for being one of the most bike-friendly cities in America, suddenly became its own worst enemy in the investigation. Thousands of cyclists navigated its stylish yet practical streets every day, blending effortlessly into the urban landscape. A black bike disappearing into a crowd was as unremarkable as a shadow slinking under the faint glow of a streetlight. Yet Wallace was undeterred. "The anonymity is deliberate," she said, tapping Rachel's file. "He's hiding in the ordinary, and that's exactly where we'll find him." The team launched a multi-pronged search. Officers scoured surveillance footage near Rachel's attack, flagging any cyclist riding through the nearby Cascade trails. They partnered with repair shops, asking owners to look out for any older bikes that had recently been painted or modified. Flyers went out to the public, urging anyone with information about suspicious bike activity to call in tips. The breakthrough came faster than Wallace expected. 4 days after the public plea, a tip arrived from an employee at a small bike repair shop just outside the city's downtown district. "This guy came in asking for parts a couple weeks back," the tipster explained to a uniformed officer. "Thing is, he was real specific. Black handlebars, black tires. I remember thinking, that bike doesn't need new parts, it just needed paint. I figured he was trying to make it look less noticeable or cover rust, maybe, but something about him felt off." Wallace pressed the tipster for details. What did the man look like? How did he act? Was there an address, a name? The employee hesitated, trying to recall everything. "He wasn't chatty," they admitted. "Kept his head down most of the time, middle-aged, maybe 40, wore a hoodie and gloves, paid in cash. Oh, and..." They paused. "He didn't drive. Most people bring their bikes in by car, but this guy rode his. Towed a cart behind it, which I thought was odd for a bike that old." The mention of the cart lit a fuse in Wallace's mind. A cart could mean transportation for his gear, or worse, his victims. She felt her pulse quicken as the pieces began to connect. "Did he say where he was headed?" she asked urgently. Unfortunately, the answer was no, but the bike shop clerk had one more key piece of information: a receipt. The receipt didn't have much, just a timestamp, a list of parts purchased, and the store's own identification number. But it gave Wallace a location and a moment in time that she could work with. "He came here," Wallace said to her team, pointing to the shop's spot on the map during their briefing. "And if he came here, he's been through this area. All of our resources are focusing on this quadrant. Surveillance, canvassing, witnesses, whatever it takes." Geographic profiling software was employed using the bike shop's location alongside previous crime scenes to triangulate potential movements of the killer. A shocking pattern emerged. All the confirmed murders, the sighting of his van reported weeks earlier, and now the bike shop formed a loose perimeter around a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. Dense with bike trails, abandoned warehouses, and sparse residential zones, it was the perfect hunting ground for a predator who thrived on silence. While Wallace's team combed through the area, another tip came in, this time from a local resident. "There's this guy," they told the dispatcher, voice nervous, "up near the old logging trail. He's always riding this black bike, real quiet. Sometimes he pulls a cart behind him, gotta admit, gives me the creeps, and lately, he's been out late at night. Thought it was weird. The mention of late-night bike rides was enough to launch an immediate undercover operation. Officers patrolled the suspected areas on foot and by car, while Wallace herself monitored surveillance from HQ. Tensions ran high as the team waited, scanning for any sign of the phantom cyclist. Days passed with no movement. Wallace's impatience grew, but she knew better than to rush. They needed this to be airtight. When the killer finally surfaced, it was almost anticlimactic. One of the undercover officers, positioned near a dimly lit wooded trail, caught sight of a lone cyclist. Black bike, black hoodie, cart in tow, calm, slow, deliberate. The man didn't look suspicious to passers-by, just another Portlander enjoying the city's bike-friendly infrastructure. But for Wallace's team it was like spotting prey in a sea of camouflage. "Don't lose him," Wallace ordered over the radio, "but don't spook him either." The officer followed cautiously, keeping to the shadows until the cyclist led them to a run-down property on the edge of the forest. The house was small, isolated and unkempt, a perfect hideout for someone who wanted to disappear. The bike, unmistakable in its repainted black coat, was left leaning against the garage. The cart was detached and hauled inside. Wallace knew they had him. "We wait," she instructed her team. "No rash moves. We need the warrant, and we need to know exactly what's inside that house." For the first time in weeks, Wallace felt the scales tipping in their favor. The bicycle that had once been the killer's perfect cover was now his downfall. Surveillance and approaching the suspect. The suspect had a face now, a shadow pulled from the fog and into the crosshairs of law enforcement. Detective Emma Wallace stood at the edge of the makeshift command center, staring at the latest pinned photograph, a grainy still from surveillance footage showing a lone cyclist, dark hoodie obscuring his features, pedaling silently toward the run-down property deep in the outskirts of Portland. The property was their target, and the man inside was Matthew Lanson, a recluse with no known friends or family, just a sliver of a criminal record that barely raised alarms years earlier. "We've got him," Wallace said with quiet resolve to the assembled team. But having Lanson wasn't the same as catching him red-handed. To build a rock-solid case capable of holding up in court, they needed more evidence, more proof linking him directly to the killings. For now, they could only watch, analyze, and wait for Lanson to make a mistake. Lanson's home was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. The small, dilapidated ranch was tucked into a wooded area just beyond the edge of a sparsely populated suburb. It had no close neighbors, no consistent signs of activity, and no obvious connections to anyone in the city. But Wallace knew better than to be fooled by its quiet exterior. Inside that house, she was certain, was the key to ending months of fear and chaos. The task force wasted no time setting up a comprehensive surveillance operation. A mobile command van was parked a half-mile away from the property, packed with high-tech equipment to monitor movement around Lanson's home. Drones equipped with night vision cameras hovered discreetly above the tree line, providing a bird's-eye view, while officers dressed in camouflage uniforms established hidden observation posts along well-worn trails surrounding the suspect's property. "Keep these eyes on him at all times," Wallace instructed during the mission briefing. "Anything out of the ordinary, no matter how small, gets reported. If he so much as takes out his trash, I want to know about it." Special Agent David Marks from the FBI, who had joined the task force weeks earlier, nodded in agreement. "This guy's a ghost," Marks added. "He's managed to stay hidden for months because he knows how to control his environment. Don't underestimate him. He might already know we're watching." Wallace noted his warning, but she doubted Lanson suspected anything. His movements, as recorded over the next 48 hours, showed a man deeply set in his routine, or more accurately in his seclusion. He rarely left the property except for occasional late-night trips on his bike. These rides were brief and deliberate. He'd disappear into the dense woods lining the property, and reappear on surveillance an hour or two later, often carrying supplies in the cart attached to his bike. Every time he returned, he immediately barricaded himself inside his home. "We're looking at a survivalist type," Marks observed during one of the shift changes at HQ. "He's self-sufficient and avoids drawing attention. He's not running to the corner store for milk. He's scavenging, finding what he needs in places we're not paying attention to." Wallace stared at the live feed, her mind racing through possibilities. If he's that cautious, he's hiding something inside that house. There's no way someone like him leaves behind a digital footprint or paper trail. This guy's whole life is in there. The only problem? They couldn't just storm in without cause. The legal barrier of obtaining a search warrant loomed large, and despite mounting suspicion, Wallace knew they didn't yet have enough evidence to justify breaking through Lanson's door. Surveillance and patience were their only tools for the moment. But patience doesn't mean inaction, Wallace reminded her team. We keep him boxed in. If he's ready to bolt, we close the gap. Within the next few days, the team's surveillance began picking up subtle, unsettling details. Lanson's late-night rides grew more frequent, and the contents of his cart became stranger. Carefully zoomed drone footage revealed what looked like plastic sheeting, hunting knives, and lengths of rope among the items he toted back into the house. Then there was the delivery, a weathered van pulling up to the edge of the property, leaving a small, unmarked package on the front porch before quickly disappearing. The team analyzed the footage in painstaking detail. "Could be supplies," one officer suggested. "Or tools," Wallace countered, her voice laced with tension. The deeper the team probed into Lanson's patterns, the more disturbing the picture became. Records pulled from hardware stores across the city, tracked by the task force's allies, revealed purchases consistent with someone preparing for something sinister. Duct tape, surgical gloves, and large rolls of industrial-strength garbage bags. Everything was screaming premeditation, but Wallace still didn't have what she needed to make a move, proof that tied Lanson directly to the murders and their gruesome aftermath. The waiting game pressed on, but tensions inside the task force were mounting. "How long do we do this?" one junior detective asked during a quiet moment inside HQ. "We know it's him. We know what he's done. Do we really just wait for him to hurt someone else before we go in?" Wallace turned to face him, her expression sharp, but tempered with understanding. "We're not waiting for another body," she replied. "We're waiting for him to give us the evidence we need so no jury in the world lets him slip through the cracks." Finally, after nearly a week of exhaustive watching and waiting, Lanson appeared to make his first crucial mistake. One night, just as the moon rose high over the darkened forest surrounding his property, Lanson emerged on his bike again. But this time, he wasn't just cycling through his usual woodsy loop. He was carrying 2 large, rolled-up bundles coated in plastic and shoved into his cart. As drone footage followed his progress through the trails, Lanson stopped at a remote clearing and began digging. The task force, watching in tense silence from HQ, immediately raised alarms. "He's burying something," one officer muttered under his breath. "He knows we're too far away to physically track him," Wallace said, her fists clenched. "But not anymore. We close in tonight." Wallace made the call. It was time to move. The task force assembled quickly, armed and ready to carry out a warrant request first thing in the morning. "If he's cleaning up," Wallace said, "it's because he knows what's coming. So do we." As the first rays of dawn crept over Portland's horizon, authorities began surrounding Lanson's house. The man who had cast a shadow over their city was finally in their sights, and for the first time, Wallace felt the weight of his reign begin to lift. The search warrant, and a shocking discovery. The morning was crisp and still when Detective Emma Wallace held the freshly signed search warrant in her hand. After months of fear, frustration, and sleepless nights, this piece of paper gave her team the legal grounds to storm Matthew Lanson's property. Today marked a turning point, one that could finally bring an end to months of terror in Portland. Wallace double-checked every detail on the warrant, ensuring that no errors could jeopardize what came next. This was their moment, and there was no room for mistakes. "All right, team," Wallace began, addressing her gathered squad in the cramped command van parked a half-mile from Lanson's property. "We've waited long enough to hit this guy. We've got one shot at this, and I don't want anyone walking away thinking they left anything undone. He's smart, careful, and methodical, but today we're ending this." Special Agent David Marks from the FBI stood beside her, his arms crossed, his expression stern but focused. "We move in surgically," he added, his calm voice reinforcing Wallace's intensity. "Our mission is clear. Secure the suspect, clear the property, and recover the evidence. This doesn't end with just an arrest. We need everything we can use to tie him to the murders." Wallace nodded, scanning the room with sharp eyes. "Remember, this guy has outsmarted us at every turn until now. Don't underestimate him. We know he's meticulous, we know he's dangerous, and most importantly, we know he'll do anything to protect himself. Stay sharp." The process unfolded with cold precision. SWAT officers in tactical gear loaded into armored vans, their black uniforms blending into the early morning shadows. Detectives in plain clothes prepped for evidence collection, while surveillance drones buzzed quietly overhead, offering a real-time feed of Lanson's house. They could see the suspect's bike leaning against the garage, its black paint gleaming faintly in the dim light of dawn. "He's there," one officer confirmed over the radio. "No movement, but the house is occupied. Looks like he's holed up." "All right," Wallace said, her voice steady but brimming with tension. "Let's move." The convoy rolled in silently, tires crunching on gravel as they surrounded the remote property. Officers fanned out, their positions calculated and rehearsed during countless briefing sessions. SWAT took the lead, their shields and battering rams gleaming in the faint light. Wallace hung back near the command van, her hand hovering over her radio. Despite the meticulous preparations, her gut churned. This was the man who had evaded them for so long. She didn't dare assume it would go smoothly. The pounding on Lanson's front door shattered the quiet. "Police! Search warrant! Open up!" the lead officer bellowed, his voice carrying through the trees. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, faint movement. Wallace watched the live feed on the screen in the van as curtains in an upstairs window twitched ever so slightly. "He's stalling," Marks muttered next to her, his arms crossed tightly. After a few tense heartbeats, the SWAT team breached the door with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the woods as officers poured inside, their movements coordinated and swift. Guns drawn, they cleared each room with precision while shouting commands. "Clear!" "Moving to the next room? No suspect in sight!" Wallace gripped her radio. "Stay cautious," she urged. "If he's not going quietly, he'll have a plan." The first floor turned up nothing but sparse furniture, empty beer cans, and a faint, sickly odor that clung to the air. But then came the call from upstairs. "We have him!" Wallace bolted from the command van, weaving through the chaos as officers escorted Matthew Lanson out of the house in handcuffs. He looked startlingly ordinary, middle-aged, medium build, his features scruffy but unremarkable. He didn't say a word as they led him to a squad car. But his gaze, Wallace couldn't shake the eerie calm in his eyes. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was something darker. "I'd bet my life he's got something in that house," Mark said as he approached her. "Trust me," Wallace replied grimly. "I already expect it." The search team didn't take long to confirm her suspicions. The property was packed with evidence, but nothing could prepare them for what lay hidden in the garage. A small makeshift workspace had been set up along one wall, complete with tools, duct tape, knives, plastic sheeting, and a collection of women's personal items. Bracelets, keys, even a wallet. "He kept trophies," one detective murmured, as they bagged the evidence. "No," Wallace corrected coldly. "He kept reminders." The discoveries didn't end there. Hidden beneath a false floor panel in the garage was a cooler, sealed tightly with zip ties. When officers cracked it open, the smell knocked several of them back. Inside were bloody scraps of clothing, hair, and most horrifyingly, what appeared to be human teeth. Wallace's face hardened as she stared at the macabre collection. "This," she said quietly, "is why he was so confident. He thought no one would ever find this." The basement yielded more horrors. Officers discovered a locked room accessible only through a hidden panel in the wall. The room was soundproofed, the walls lined with rubber insulation, and the floor coated in plastic sheeting. A single chair sat in the center of the room, surrounded by an array of tools that left no doubt what the room had been used for. "He did everything here," Mark said, his voice heavy with disgust. Wallace nodded, her eyes scanning the room methodically. He knew exactly how to control his environment. Every detail was thought out. As the investigation stretched into the evening, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. DNA evidence from the trophies matched two of the victims, while the crude burial site Lanson had dug in the forest held disturbing remnants of others. The evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the day, as Wallace stepped out of the house and into the cool evening air, she felt the first glimmer of relief in months. They had him, and everything they needed to ensure he'd never walk free again. "How does it feel?" Marks asked, coming to stand beside her. She exhaled deeply. "Like it's not over yet," she admitted, "but at least we're one step closer to justice for those women." Lanson hadn't said a word all day, but to Wallace that didn't matter. His silence would not save him now. The evidence spoke louder than anything he could ever say. The confession and violent motive. The interrogation room was stark. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a single steel chair pulled out just far enough for its occupant to lean back slightly, but deliberately. Matthew Lanson sat there, cuffed, his unkempt hair shadowing part of his face as Detective Emma Wallace entered the room. His eyes lifted only briefly, enough for her to sense something chilling in the calmness he exuded, despite the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Wallace had seen killers before, many times in her 15 years as an investigator, but Lanson was different. His silence wasn't rooted in fear, It had an unnerving self-awareness, like a man proud of his handiwork. Wallace tossed a thick case folder onto the table in front of him, the sound echoing through the small room. She decided she wasn't going to come at him soft. Men like him thrived on control, and the last thing she would let this monster feel was dominance. "Matthew," she began, taking a seat across from him. Her tone was sharp, no room for pleasantries. "We know what you did, we've got your trophies, we've got your DNA, we've got witnesses, surveillance footage, everything. So, let me save you some time. If you think sitting there quietly is gonna help you, it won't. The only thing you've got left is what you choose to say in this room, so talk." Lanson didn't flinch. For an uncomfortably long moment, he didn't react at all. Instead, his eyes shifted slowly to the folder sitting between them. His fingers tapped once, twice, on the cold steel cuffs. And then, he did something unexpected. He smiled. "You think you've caught me," he said, his voice surprisingly soft but oddly unsettling. It was the first time any of the officers in the observation room behind the double-sided glass had heard him speak. "But you don't know anything about me." Wallace leaned in just slightly, locking her eyes onto his. "Is that right?" she shot back, her voice cutting. She flipped the folder open, revealing crime scene photos that even the most seasoned detectives had a hard time looking at. Wallace wasn't here to play nice. If she had to push him to the edge, she would. "We know plenty, Matthew. I've read every report, seen every image. I've walked through the nightmares you left behind. Trust me, I know you." "But you don't know why," Lanson replied quietly, his voice almost a whisper, before leaning back and letting out an exhale that might have been relief, or something closer to pride. "The why—" he tapped the side of his head with one finger. "That's what really matters, isn't it?" Wallace didn't blink. "Then why don't you tell me, Matthew? Why did you kill them? You enjoyed it, didn't you? The power, the fear, the control." She let the word control hang in the air, knowing it might strike a nerve. That seemed to hit its mark. His smile faded, replaced with something colder, sharper. "Control," he repeated, his voice tightening. "You don't get it. It wasn't about the control. Not at first." Wallace raised an eyebrow. This was it, the crack she needed. "Go on," she urged, keeping her tone steady but pressing. "What was it about then?" Lanson's eyes drifted, not to the folder on the table or the room around him, but to something only he could see in his memory. "It was about fixing things," he finally said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge that slithered into his tone, one that dripped with bitterness. "They weren't innocent, you know. Not to me. None of them were." He paused, studying Wallace for a reaction, but she gave him nothing. He continued, leaning forward for the first time. "Every single one of them. They reminded me of her. Of her." Wallace didn't need to ask who her was. She'd read the files on Lanson's past, and she knew the events she was about to hear confirmed what the profiler had theorized. Still, she played along, keeping him talking. "Her who?" she prompted. He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "My ex-wife," he said finally, his voice twisting with disdain. "The woman who ripped me apart piece by piece until there was nothing left. Took my money, took my dignity, took my life. And you know what the world did? Nothing. They stood there and watched it happen, told me to pick myself up and keep going. I gave her everything, and when she was done using me, she threw me away." He snapped his fingers for emphasis, his face now contorted with rage. "Like I was garbage." Wallace stayed silent, letting his words hang in the stale air. "All of them," Lanson went on, his voice quieter now but no less venomous. "All those women I picked, they were just like her. Not on the outside, but inside. I could see it in their eyes. The way they walked, the way they talked to people. I could tell who they were, and they were gonna hurt someone else just like she hurt me. So what I did—" He leaned back again, taking in Wallace's vigilant expression. "It wasn't murder. It was taking out the trash." Wallace narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening, but she didn't interrupt. "Not yet." "And you think that justifies what you did?" she asked after a beat. Her voice was colder now, controlled, but firm. "You think you had the right to decide who lived and who didn't because you had a bad breakup?" Lanson smirked, tilting his head. "You make it sound so small, detective. But I didn't just wake up one day and decide. I watched, I studied, I knew who they were, pretenders, manipulators, liars. You don't believe me, but you didn't know them like I did." Wallace slammed her hand down on the table, sending a sharp sound through the room. "You didn't know them either, Matthew. They were innocent women, teachers, students, daughters, sisters, all of them living their lives, and you stole that from them. No one gave you the right." Lanson didn't react to her anger. Instead, he leaned forward again, the eerie calmness returning to his gaze. "You think I'm the monster," he murmured, "because I did what no one else had the guts to do. The world is filled with people like them, Detective. I did what you don't have the stomach for." Wallace's expression didn't crack, but inside, her blood boiled. She felt the weight of every victim, every family grieving, and she wasn't going to let him twist the narrative to make himself into some kind of dark savior. "You didn't protect anyone," she shot back. "You destroyed lives, and now you're done. The evidence, your trophies, your mistakes, they've caught up with you. You don't walk out of this room a legend, Lanson. You walk out a coward." He let the silence draw out again, then finally leaned back with a sigh. "Coward?" he repeated softly. "We'll see." But Wallace didn't need to see. She had what she wanted, a confession, unfiltered and bathed in the twisted reasoning of a killer who thought his violence served a higher purpose. Now it was up to the justice system to ensure his poisonous ideology wouldn't hurt anyone else. Outside the room, Wallace pulled the door shut behind her and exhaled deeply as Agent Marks approached. "So?" he asked. "He's not sorry," Wallace replied grimly, "but he's done. The death sentence and the end of the killing spree." The courtroom was packed. The air inside was thick with barely whispered murmurs, the tension mounting as people took their seats. Family members of the victims filled the front rows, their faces etched with a mix of sorrow and hard-earned determination. Reporters sat in the back, their pens poised and cameras discreetly ready to catch the moment when justice for Portland's long nightmare would finally be served. Detective Emma Wallace sat silently at the prosecutor's table, her notes organized into neat stacks. She wasn't here to speak today. Her work had been done, months of searching, interviewing, breaking the wall of silence in Matthew Lanson's dark mind. But her presence carried weight. Her mere presence in the courtroom represented the relentless pursuit of truth, the grinding endeavor to bring light into the shadowed corners where Portland's killer had lurked for too long. At the defense table sat Lanson, his face stoic but far from serene. Even in shackles, he exuded a disquieting stillness. He had refused to meet the eyes of the victims' families since the beginning of the trial. To observers, it wasn't shame or fear, it was something colder, something that made anyone near him uneasy. To Wallace, the look was familiar. It was the calculated avoidance of a man who still clung to control in his own twisted way. "All rise!" the bailiff called out, his voice echoing in the silent chamber, snapping everyone to their feet as the judge entered. Judge Eleanor Green, a no-nonsense figure with years on the Portland Circuit Court bench, took her seat, adjusting her glasses. She glanced down at the papers in front of her, her expression unreadable. The weight of her responsibility carried heavily in her presence. She had presided over many high-profile cases, but this case was unlike any other. Matthew Lanson sat motionless as the proceedings began, his hands cuffed but resting calmly on the table. The prosecutor, a seasoned trial attorney named Jack Carlson, rose for his closing argument. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Carlson began, his voice confident but solemn, respectful of the gravity of the moment. "For 35 agonizing months the city of Portland lived in fear. 12 women lost their lives senselessly, each stolen from their families in a brutal and calculated manner. This wasn't random. This wasn't impulsive. These were deliberate, thought-out acts of violence designed to terrorize both the victims and this community." He paused, the weight of his words sinking into the room. "Matthew Lanson is no ordinary murderer. He is a manipulative predator, someone who crafted fear as a form of control. He didn't just kill, he hunted. He selected his victims carefully, transported them to secluded locations, and left behind a legacy of terror. And even when we caught him, even when faced with irrefutable evidence, he showed no remorse. Not one word of apology, no plea for forgiveness, nothing." Carlson leaned into the jury, his voice dropping. "The jury's conviction was clear. You found him guilty of every count, murder, kidnapping, premeditated assault. But now, the families of these women deserve something more than a guilty verdict. They deserve justice." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the state of Oregon requests the maximum penalty, a sentence of death." The room was silent. The mention of the death penalty sent ripples of emotion through the crowd. For the families, it carried a mix of relief and heaviness. For some, it meant closure. For others, it felt like it wasn't enough. When the prosecutor sat down, Wallace noticed Lanson shift for the first time. He leaned slightly toward his defense attorney, murmuring something inaudible. Wallace could almost feel the chill creep into the room as his attorney, a reserved but capable defender named Rachel Grady, rose to give her final argument. "Matthew Lanson," Grady began quietly, acknowledging the room, has been convicted of horrific crimes, and nothing I say here is meant to dispute that. But the question today is not whether he deserves punishment, it is how that punishment will be carried out. The death penalty is irreversible, it cannot be undone. By sentencing him to life imprisonment, we do not absolve him of responsibility. We ensure that every single day behind bars he is reminded of what he did. A sentence of life without parole accomplishes that equally as much as death. Wallace's jaw tightened. She had expected this argument, after all it was one of the standard points of opposition to the death penalty, but it didn't sit well with her. The images of the murder scenes were too vivid in her mind, the women's faces too real. Life behind bars felt insufficient for a reign of terror this calculated and cold. After final statements concluded, Judge Green's voice brought the room back to reality. The court will adjourn briefly before delivering sentencing. The tension in the room shifted quickly to whispers and murmurs once again as thoughts swirled about what the final decision might be. Wallace watched as Lanson was led out of the courtroom, still refusing to look at the rows of grieving families. Her stomach churned. She had stared into the darkness of killers like him before, peered into the bottomless pit of their violent minds. But Matthew Lanson was different. He wasn't just calculating. He believed every monstrous act served a purpose. When the court reconvened, and the judge returned, you could hear a pin drop in the room. This court has reviewed the evidence submitted and the testimonies presented. The defendant's actions, as proven beyond doubt, demonstrate a clear pattern of premeditation, cruelty, and lack of remorse for the lives destroyed by these heinous acts. Justice demands accountability, Judge Green said, her voice steady. For the first-degree murders of 12 individuals, in addition to kidnapping and aggravated assault, this court sentences Matthew Lanson to death by lethal injection. The air left the room in a collective exhale. Some families broke into quiet sobs, hugging one another, others stared numbly ahead, the weight of years of justice finally crashing down. Wallace felt her own shoulders ease, though the knot in her stomach remained. There was no satisfaction in this moment, not really. No verdict, no sentence could ever truly repair what was lost. But this? At least this meant he would never harm anyone again. As Lanson was escorted out, cuffed and silent, he glanced back for a brief moment and locked eyes with Wallace through the crowd. She held his gaze, unflinching. Whatever message he thought he was sending, whatever tangled justification he wanted to cling to, it didn't matter. His time had run out. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed family members and attorneys for statements, but Wallace slipped through the chaos, retreating to the quieter steps of the courthouse. Agent Marks joined her moments later, his face marked with both exhaustion and a faint sense of relief. "Well," he said, exhaling, "it's done." Wallace nodded slowly, though a faraway look lingered in her eyes. "It's done for him," she said, "but not for the families, not for the city." "You did good," Marks added. "Without you, he'd still be out there." She leaned back against the railing, letting out a long breath. "I just hope," she murmured, "this is enough for them to sleep a little easier tonight." And with that, the chapter was closed on Portland's darkest nightmare, though its scars would linger for years to come. Lessons learned and warnings from the investigation. The press conference was scheduled for late afternoon, just as the sun began casting long shadows over the Portland Police Department's headquarters. Reporters lined the room, cameras flashing, notebooks ready to take down the reflections of those who had dedicated nearly a year of their lives to stopping Matthew Lanson. Detective Emma Wallace stood near the back of the podium, while the chief of police, a broad-shouldered man with years of grit etched into his stoic posture, took center stage to open the proceedings. "We gather today not for celebration," the chief began solemnly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what had transpired. "Justice may have caught up with Matthew Lanson, but scars remain not only for his victims' families but for the entire city. A tragedy of this magnitude calls on all of us to reflect, to learn, and to recommit ourselves to the work of protecting our communities." Wallace shifted slightly in place, her mind busy combing over the memories of the months leading up to the long-awaited resolution. Every late-night autopsy report, every dead-end lead, every failure that felt like another life teetering on the brink, it all sandwiched against the victories they eventually carved out. As the chief handed the podium over to her, all eyes turned toward the woman who had become the face of the investigation, whether she wanted the title or not. She took a moment, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "Good afternoon," she began with a slow inhale and even slower exhale. "The Portland Shadow investigation has been one of the most challenging cases of my entire career, and not because we didn't have good people working on it. We had some of the best. It was because this case wasn't just about catching a killer. It was about understanding him, tracking not just his movements but his motivations. And more than that, it was about staying one step ahead of someone who seemed to anticipate our every move. The room held its collective breath, waiting for her to continue. For nearly 3 years Matthew Lanson terrorized this city. For nearly 3 years he thrived in the spaces we often take for granted, the alleys, the quiet streets, the wooded trails we pass every day without a second thought. And his victims? They weren't flashy targets. They were everyday women, teachers, students, daughters who worked late, walked alone, or simply lived trusting the city they called home would be a safe one. We can all think, it couldn't have been me. But the truth is, it could have been. Lanson didn't pick women based on fame or fortune. He chose them based on opportunity and routine. And that's why his name strikes fear into our hearts. He thrived on normalcy, and that's part of what we need to learn from this. Wallace paused, looking at the reporters, the cameras, the family members sitting in the back of the room. She thought about the faces of the 12 victims whose lives were forever etched into her memories, and her voice softened as she continued. Investigations like this are never perfect, she admitted, her tone heavy with emotion but determined. There were times when we hit walls where we doubted if we would find him at all, but this isn't just about the law enforcement officers who worked this case. It's also about you, the community, and how you stepped up. I remember the tips from Portlanders who noticed something that didn't sit right, those tiny moments of courage when someone called a hotline, reported suspicious behavior, or double-checked a midnight shadow that stayed too long on their street. Those moments mattered. Those moments reminded us all that keeping cities safe isn't just our responsibility, it's a collective effort. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dipping slightly as if she were letting everyone in on something deeply personal. But here's the other lesson. Vigilance. Matthew Lanson depended on us looking the other way. He depended on dark corners and isolated spaces free from scrutiny. And yet, we made mistakes he exploited. There are lessons in those mistakes, and I will not shy away from admitting them. Our city wasn't ready for how cruel and meticulous he was, and it shows us what we can do better, not just when pursuing justice but in preventing this from ever happening again. That means investing in better policing tools, prioritizing the safety of late-shift workers, and raising awareness about personal safety without creating fear. It means educating people about how predators like him operate, not to scare, but to inform. Her next words hit harder, sharper. Ladies especially, I know what you've been thinking. Don't walk at night. Don't work alone. Be aware of your surroundings. And those are good warnings. But they aren't solutions. We can and we must do better as a society to ensure no one has to live with those fears constantly on their minds, because fear shouldn't just be another part of normal life. Wallace shifted her weight slightly, her voice steady now with the kind of cold determination that had kept her going through sleepless nights reviewing crime scene photos. Then, there's the lesson of persistence, she added. Lanson almost slipped through our fingers more times than I care to admit, not because we weren't trying but because he was calculated, meticulous. He erased traces of himself we didn't even realize he left, and maybe there are more like him out there waiting for the same dark spaces to shield them. This case reminded me, and all of us I hope, that justice isn't automatic. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It takes people, real people, showing up, refusing to give up even when the path forward seems impossible. Her tone lightened slightly as she leaned back, gripping the edges of the podium. Because we didn't give up, she said, looking directly at the families in the back. We have justice today, and Matthew Lanson's conviction, his sentence, those belong to you, to your daughters, your sisters, your mothers, your friends. This win doesn't erase what happened, and I know it won't make the pain easier, but it does give us one thing: closure. And sometimes closure is the first step to healing. The room was silent for a long moment before a thunder of clicks from cameras and pens started filling the space. Wallace's words, raw and unpolished, carved into the minds of those present. As the press conference came to a close, Wallace stepped off the podium, shaking a few hands as she moved toward the exit. Agent David Marks caught up with her near the hallway. "That was one hell of a speech," he said, falling into step beside her. His voice carried a rare note of approval she wasn't used to from him. "It wasn't a speech," Wallace replied, glancing sideways at him. "It was just the truth." Marks nodded, pulling open the door as they headed outside. Sunlight poured onto the courthouse steps, and on the sidewalk below, families of the victims hugged one another tightly. A sense of finality hung in the air, But for Wallace, the work wasn't over. It never would be. "Think this will stick with people?" Marks asked, his tone lighter now, almost playful. "It better," Wallace replied, looking out at the distant skyline of Portland. "Because if there's one thing I know about predators like Matthew Lanson, it's this: they don't wait. Somewhere someone already thinks they can get away with it, and it's our job to prove them wrong every time." For Wallace, justice wasn't about closure alone. It was a promise to chase the shadows wherever they fled, no matter how long or how dark the road seemed.